woman may buy her way into the aristocracy, but she cannot buy the silence of her own blood. England, 1834. The rain had been relentless that March, soaking the chalk downs and leaving the fields in grey ruin. It was in that same year that the Herbert name began its long descent into whispers, debts and the kind of scandals that polite society spoke of only behind locked doors. But the story that concerns us does not properly begin until half a century later, when a young woman, neither wholly legitimate nor entirely accepted, stepped into Highclere Castle and altered the destiny of one of England's most ancient families. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. Almina Victoria Maria Alexandra Wombwell was born in 1876 under a sky already stained with secrecy. Officially, she was the daughter of Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, a man of service and title, but not of remarkable fortune. Unofficially, indeed, whispered with a kind of resigned certainty among those who traded in London gossip, she was the natural daughter of Alfred D. Rothschild, the eccentric and extravagantly wealthy banker, whose name alone commanded obedience and envy in equal measure. Almina grew up in a house divided between appearances and truth. On one hand, she enjoyed the privileges of a Rothschild's unofficial acknowledgement, fine dresses, the best tutors, and an income that never faltered. On the other hand, she bore the burden of illegitimacy, mark that in Victorian society was more damning than poverty. She was spoken of as half in, half out, welcomed at dinners, yet never entirely embraced. It is here at this intersection of money and shame that the future Countess of Carnarvon was fashioned. By the 1890s, Highclere Castle, ancestral seat of the Herbert family, was collapsing under the weight of unpaid debts and dissipated fortune. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux, Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had inherited not only the castle but the ruin that came with it. He was reckless with his money, reckless with his health, and reckless with his name. The young Earl sought relief in cards, horses, and women. What he required was not merely a wife but a savior, a woman whose fortune might purchase the continuation of his title. Thus, in June of 1895, the unlikely bargain was struck. Almina Wombwell, aged 19, became Lady Almina Carnarvon. The marriage united two desperate needs, her hunger for legitimacy and his hunger for wealth. Alfred D. Rothschild supplied the dowry, vast enough to restore Highclere's dignity overnight. Newspapers of the day described the wedding as a romance. Those who knew better described it as a transaction. The truth, as ever, sat uneasily between the two. What followed is often dressed up in novels as a fairy tale, a poor girl lifted into the glittering sphere of aristocracy. But the reality was far darker. For while Almina entered Highclere with youth and ambition, she also carried into its halls a restless unease. She had wealth, yes. She had status, yes. But she lacked the one thing that neither her husband nor her patron could ever bestow: legitimacy of blood. This sense of incompleteness festered. It made her controlling, it made her reckless, and in time it would make her cruel. Accounts from servants at Highclere in those early years speak of a young countess whose charm could shift to fury in a single evening. She sought to dominate not only the household but her husband, and though George Herbert relished the comforts her fortune afforded, he chafed at her authority. His nights became longer, his indulgences in Egypt and on the continent more suspicious. Almina, for her part, learned quickly how to use her connections, and more importantly her secrecy, as weapons. But perhaps the first true fracture in the illusion of her fairy tale came with the birth of her son Henry. Officially, he was Henry Herbert, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon. Unofficially, society whispered again. His features bore the trace of another man, Prince Victor Duleep Singh, heir of the last Maharaja of the Punjab. The rumor was never proven, never acknowledged, yet it never disappeared. For Almina, the ambiguity worked both ways. It secured her legacy and gave her leverage over those who might dare to dismiss her. By 1914, the Great War offered Almina a new stage on which to display her authority. Highclere was converted into a hospital for wounded officers. To the public it was philanthropy, patriotism, sacrifice. To those inside its walls it was something colder. Almina selected her patients carefully, favoring those of rank and connection. She moved among them like a queen in white, issuing commands to surgeons, dictating treatments, even insisting upon the most invasive procedure. The castle smelled of ether and iodine, but beneath it all it reeked of control. It is here that whispers of darker practices began to circulate. Not all operations were necessary, not all men survived, and in the hushed corridors of the hospital, some servants claimed to have seen things not recorded in any medical log, interventions that had less to do with healing and more to do with experiment. For Almina had begun to nurture an obsession, the manipulation of life itself, and where that obsession led, history is reluctant to follow. A castle may be built of stone, but it is held together only by the silence of those who serve within it. By the second decade of the 20th century, Highclere Castle had become less a home and more a theatre. Its halls echoed with footsteps not only of the Herbert family, but of nurses, surgeons, soldiers, and attendants. The war had given Almina Carnarvon her chance to command something greater than a household. Now she presided over a hospital that bore her name, her ambition, and her shadow. Publicly she was hailed as a heroine. The Illustrated London News ran portraits of her in crisp nurses' whites, standing amid wounded officers, as though Florence Nightingale herself had been reborn. Visitors praised the efficiency of Highclere's wards, the luxury of its treatments, and the miraculous recoveries that seemed to occur under her supervision. Letters poured in from grateful families, whose sons had been restored, but diaries and service records paint a far less orderly picture. One orderly, a young man named Thomas Mallory, later confessed in a private memoir that he had carried more bodies out of Highclere than the official register ever admitted. They went in with wounds that should have healed, he wrote, and came out under sheets before their time. He spoke of operations performed at odd hours, when even the surgeons seemed uncertain of their purpose. He recalled medicines administered in doses unrecorded, blood transfusions attempted with reckless haste, and a countess who insisted upon standing over every procedure, her eyes fixed, unblinking, as though memorizing each incision. In the language of the medical journals of the time, these were experimental treatments. In the whispered language of the servants, they were something far darker. But Almina's obsession was not confined to the soldier. Whispers began of private patients, women of society, who arrived discreetly at Highclere, and were never mentioned again. They came under the guise of convalescents, it was said. Some had fallen into delicate circumstances, others were simply inconvenient to their family. For them the Countess offered a different kind of service. Abortions were illegal, shameful, and often deadly, yet Almina had both the resources and the arrogance to conduct them within her private wards. Testimonies collected years later by midwives and physicians suggested that certain London ladies owed their continued reputations to her interventions. Whether those women ever left Highclere unscathed is another question. One nurse interviewed decades after the war recalled the distinct cries she had heard on more than one night. They were not the groans of soldiers, nor the moans of the dying. They were the sharper, higher screams of women in labor, or in its brutal termination. She remembered Almina's voice commanding silence, remembered the sight of sheets, hastily bundled, and remembered most of all, the smell, metallic, coppery, unmistakable. George Herbert, meanwhile, continued his escapades abroad. Egypt had become his refuge, his playground, and his undoing. Officially, he traveled in pursuit of antiquities. Unofficially, he indulged in gambling dens, brothels, and opium houses. His health deteriorated, his debts mounted, yet he returned each season with curiosities, statues, scarabs, amulets, which Almina displayed proudly, as though they might sanctify his absence. Their marriage had long ceased to resemble affection. It was an arrangement, and both knew it. Almina tolerated his vices, so long as they did not impede her own pursuits. He tolerated her dominance, so long as the money flowed. Highclere therefore became a castle of two rulers, each despising, yet depending upon the other, and in the midst of this bitterness stood their son, Henry. To society, he was the future Earl. To Almina, he was proof of her triumph, a child who cemented her claim to the title. But to George Herbert, Henry was a constant reminder of doubt. The boy's features bore resemblance to a man he loathed. Prince Victor Duleep said, whether or not the rumor of paternity was true, it gnawed at him. In drunken rages, he would hurl accusations at Almina, who met them not with denial but with icy silence. The servants spoke of shouting matches that ended with slammed doors and broken glass, yet nothing was ever admitted publicly. To the outside world, the Carnarvons remained the picture of nobility. To those inside, they were a family slowly cannibalizing itself. It was around this time that Almina's appetite for control deepened into something more sinister. Accounts suggest she began keeping her own medical notes, written in a hand both meticulous and obsessive. She recorded blood types, transfusion results, surgical outcomes. She charted which patients survived her interventions, and which did not. Some of these notebooks, it is said, were destroyed after her death. A few fragments, however, survived in private collection. One such page, examined by a later historian, contained a chilling line beneath a list of unnamed women. If they perish, it is not the fault of the hand, but but of nature's weakness. Such words suggest not compassion, but justification. By 1918, when the war drew to a weary close, Highclere had been permanently transformed. Its reputation as a hospital was lauded in public, but among the families of certain lost soldiers, unanswered questions lingered. Some spoke of bodies buried hastily, without proper right. Others wondered why certain medical records had vanished, or why officers with minor wounds had disappeared into the operating rooms never to return. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked behind the stone walls of the castle, and the silence of those bound by duty or by fear. Almina, however, emerged more powerful than ever. She had demonstrated her ability to command men, to bend medicine to her will. The trial had left Lady Almina Carnarvon, formerly Countess of Carnarvon, in tatters. Though she had escaped the immediate ruin of Dorothy Carnarvon's claims, she had not escaped exposure. For the first time the public saw her not as a benevolent angel of wartime mercy, but as a manipulator, a seductress, and a woman whose charity had been laced with corruption. Society doors closed. Former allies who once drank her wine and gossiped in her drawing rooms now crossed the street to avoid her, but Almina was not a woman to bow her head in shame. She had clawed her way into power, married into nobility, and presided over the grandeur of Highclere Castle. To her, disgrace was not an ending but an obstacle. Yet in her defiance she made choices that only hastened her fall, selling the family silver. After the trial, her son Henry, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, made good on his threat to cut her off from the estate. Almina's financial dealings had already hollowed Highclere's treasures. Paintings, silver, even rare manuscripts vanished quietly to dealers in London and Paris. Some items appeared years later in private collections. Others disappeared entirely, swallowed by the black market of aristocratic heirlooms. To Henry this was theft. To Almina it was survival. She believed herself entitled, having built Highclere's reputation through her wartime efforts and her late husband's archaeological triumphs. But Henry was unmoved. He barred her from the castle, stripped her of privileges, and made it clear she was no longer welcome within its walls. Her once illustrious name now brought only creditors. Banks circled, demanding repayment of loans she had secured with assets she no longer possessed. To stall them she concocted elaborate fictions, promises of Egyptian treasures yet unsold, investments in oil fields that did not exist, inheritances tied up in legal disputes. For a time these lies worked, but as the years passed, creditors grew impatient. Taxmen and investigators. By the late 1930s her empire of deceit began to collapse. Inland revenue investigators, already suspicious of her erratic finances, uncovered falsified ledgers and offshore transfers. Almina had thought herself clever, disguising gifts as medical donations, laundering payments through intermediaries, and shifting property titles between shell companies. But her arrogance betrayed her. Patterns emerged, identical handwriting across different signatures, mismatched dates and extravagant expenditures that could not be explained. Her past returned to haunt her. Former employees, once silenced by loyalty or fear, now spoke freely. They told of money stored in trunks, jewels hidden in false bottom drawers, and bribery passed off as hospital costs. Some even testified that she had accepted cash payments from desperate women seeking to end unwanted pregnancies. Illegal procedures quietly arranged in the aftermath of the war and covered up by her network of sympathetic doctors. The whispers of illegal abortions that had long clung to her reputation now took the shape of evidence. Names of patients, many of them young women from good families, appeared in notebooks seized by investigators. Several were linked to mysterious deaths, hemorrhages, infections, suicides after botched operations. It was a revelation too dark even for the scandal-hardened press. Though newspapers hinted at unspeakable services offered by Lady Almina, they stopped short of publishing the full truth. Respectable society still had daughters who had once visited her. Bankruptcy declared. The final blow came in 1951, after decades of dodging creditors, deceiving banks and pawning jewels. Almina was officially declared bankrupt in the High Court. The judgment was devastating. Debts exceeding £500,000, equivalent to tens of millions today. Assets stripped. Her possessions catalogued for sale. In court, the once magnificent Lady Almina appeared gaunt, her face a pale echo of its former beauty. The judge spoke of a life lived in extravagance, funded by deception, yet even in that moment, she refused to bow. She insisted she had been persecuted, betrayed by her son, cheated by dishonest partners. To her dying breath she maintained she was the victim, not the architect of her ruin. The lovers fade away. Her second husband, Colonel Carnarvon, was long dead. Their marriage had rotted under the weight of debt and scandal, and his death brought no solace. The men who had once filled her bed and her purse drifted away as her power dwindled. Without wealth to offer, Almina was no longer a woman to be courted. One by one, they abandoned her. Colonel D, once her lover and debtor, moved abroad to escape scandal. The surgeon who had shielded her in wartime eventually betrayed her, selling correspondence to journalists. Even her servants who once feared and adored her deserted her in her poverty. She was left alone in a small rented flat, surrounded not by the grandeur of Highclere, but by pawned furniture and fading portraits of better days. Death in obscurity. On May 8, 1969, Lady Almina Carnarvon died in near obscurity. There was no fanfare, no aristocratic mourning. Her death certificate recorded her simply, without title, without grandeur. She was 89 years old. The newspapers noted her passing with restraint. A few remembered her as the Countess who had turned Highclere into a hospital during the war. Fewer still mentioned the scandals that had destroyed her. Most did not mention her at all. She was buried quietly, her grave a stark contrast to the opulence she had once commanded. No jewels, no silks, no casket lined with gold, just earth and stone, swallowing a woman who had once imagined herself untouchable. The legacy of Lady Almina. History has not been kind to Lady Almina Carnarvon. In popular memory, she is often reduced to a footnote, the wealthy wife who bankrolled Lord Carnarvon's Egyptian expeditions, the patroness who gave him the means to uncover Tutankhamun's tomb. Highclere Castle today, immortalized as the setting of Downton Abbey, barely acknowledges her. Yet beneath that footnote lies a darker story, of illegal abortions, of blackmail cloaked as charity, of affairs that blurred the line between passion and exploitation. Her life was a cautionary tale, not of aristocratic excess alone, but of how power, once seized, can consume its wielder. She had everything: wealth, title, beauty, influence, and she lost it all, not through accident, but through the choices she made. When the dead are reimagined, they do not protest, they are reshaped until their sins fit the myths the living require. When Lady Almina Carnarvon was lowered into the earth in 1969, the soil closed, not only on her body, but on a lifetime of scandal, secrecy, and social disgrace. Yet the silence of the grave proved fertile ground for revision. The decades that followed saw her memory cleansed, polished and recast into a narrative more palatable to the public. History is rarely written by the disgraced. It is written by those who survived them. For Almina, that survival took the shape of historians, biographers, and eventually television producers, who found it convenient to replace a story of deception and illicit dealings with one of elegance, sacrifice and aristocratic charm. The Countess who had orchestrated illegal abortions and connived her way through financial ruin, was gradually transformed into the benevolent Lady of Highclere. The selective memory of Highclere. Highclere Castle, that towering seat of the Carnarvon dynasty, played the most decisive role in this transformation. After Almina's banishment, her son Henry Herbert, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, spent decades scrubbing her influence from its walls. Portraits of her were removed from public display. Letters and papers were locked away in family archives or discreetly destroyed. Servants were instructed never to speak of her except in tones of pity. For the Carnarvons, Almina was an embarrassment, a scandalous interloper whose debts and disgrace had nearly undone their inheritance. Yet by the late 20th century, when Highclere sought to rebrand itself as a stately home open to tourists, the family discovered that her story could not be erased entirely. Visitors asked about the Countess who had funded Lord Carnarvon's Egyptian expedition. Guides spoke of her unusual energy, her devotion to the wounded during World War I. The darker truths remained absent from the brochures. Thus Almina began her second life, not as a scandal, but as a carefully reimagined heroine of Highclere. Biographers and the gentle lie. By the 1980s and 1990s, a handful of biographers turned their attention to Lady Almina. Their works, often written with the cooperation of the Carnarvon family, leaned heavily on family archive. The narrative they produced was familiar. Almina, as the devoted wife who stood by her husband through financial hardship, the visionary who transformed Highclere into a wartime hospital, the patroness whose generosity saved countless lives. But the archives were curated. The letters detailing her debts, her desperate pleas for money, her quarrels with creditors, these were inaccessible. Testimonies of servants who had spoken of bribes, abortions, and theft were conveniently overlooked. The biographers were not liars, but they were selective. They painted only the sections of canvas that would shine. The result was a partial truth, a portrait in which Almina's flaws became eccentricities, and her manipulations became ambition. Her betrayal of her son was reframed as difficult maternal love. Even her bankruptcy was softened into a tale of financial misfortune, as though she were merely a woman undone by circumstance rather than by decades of deception. Downton Abbey and the sanitization of scandal. Then came the great cultural machine of the 21st century, television. When Downton Abbey first aired in 2010, its opening credits displayed the majestic facade of Highclere Castle. Millions of viewers across the globe came to associate that house with nobility, drama, and romance. Though fictional, Downton Abbey drew heavily from the real history of Highclere and its occupants. The wartime transformation of the castle into a hospital, depicted in the show, was lifted almost directly from Almina's actions, but the character inspired by her bore little resemblance to reality. She was softened, romanticized, a woman of duty, elegance and quiet strength. Here the most damning elements of Almina's story were excised. There were no whispers of abortion, no trials, no descent into debtor's court. Instead, the Countess of Highclere became a cultural icon of devotion, beloved by fans who saw her as the embodiment of Edwardian grace. In this way, the global phenomenon of Downton Abbey sealed Almina's second resurrection. Her sins were erased not only from aristocratic memory, but from popular imagination. Millions adored the image of her, never knowing the reality beneath. The archivist's problem. Yet for those who dig deeper, the evidence remains. A small collection of letters, stored in libraries and private collections, tells a different tale. Fragments of legal records, bankruptcy declarations, and inland revenue files reveal the scale of her financial crime. Old newspapers, yellowed and brittle, still carry reports of her courtroom dramas and public humiliations. Historians call this the archivist's problem. When the official record has been cleansed, the truth survives only in fragments, scattered like bones in the earth. To reconstruct the whole skeleton requires not just patience but courage, to resist the lure of the sanitized story and confront the rot beneath. Some modern scholars have attempted this work. Their findings are unsettling. They reveal how Almina used her wartime hospital as a cover for networking with powerful men, how she commodified the suffering of soldiers to elevate her status, how she monetized desperation through illegal medical procedure. The picture that emerges is not of an angel, but of a predator cloaked in silk. The enduring whispers, and yet even in the age of greater transparency, the full truth of Lady Almina Carnarvon remains elusive. For every archive that releases a letter, another remains sealed. For every servant's testimony, there is a gap where memory has been suppressed. Families who once entrusted their daughters to her services prefer silence. After all, their descendants still walk among us, respectable, untarnished by past disgrace. Thus her story endures in whispers, half told and half hidden. Some say this is fitting, that a woman who lived in shadows should be remembered in shadow. Others argue that confronting her misdeeds is essential, for silence only perpetuates the aristocratic privilege that allowed her to flourish. What is undeniable is that Almina's legacy remains contested. Is she the generous countess who sacrificed her fortune for the wound, or is she the calculating manipulator who destroyed lives to maintain her own? The truth perhaps is both, a warning from the past. In the end, the story of Lady Almina Carnarvon is not only the tale of a woman, but of the machinery of history itself. How facts are chosen, how memory is shaped, how scandal becomes myth. It reminds us that the aristocracy has always relied upon selective storytelling. Castles are not merely stone, they are narratives, carefully curated to protect the bloodlines within. Highclere stands today as a monument to grandeur, but beneath its gilded ceilings linger the echoes of illegal operations, hidden debts, and whispered betrayal. To walk its halls is to walk upon a palimpsest, where truth has been scraped away and replaced with fiction. And in this sense, Lady Almina has triumphed even in death. Her scandals may be known to the few, but to the many she remains untouchable. A countess, a benefactress, a legend of Highclere. For legends are harder to bury than bodies. The sins of the mother are not buried with her. They seep slow and corrosive into the blood of those left behind. By the time of Lady Almina's death in 1969, Highclere Castle was no longer merely a stately home. It was a battlefield scarred by decades of debts, disputes and secrecy, all traceable to the woman who had once commanded it with velvet authority. Though she had been barred from its halls for half a century, her presence lingered like damp in the walls, an inheritance of shame and financial ruin that her descendants could never entirely cleanse. The 6th Earl's quiet war. Henry Herbert, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, spent most of his adult life disentangling the knots his mother had tied. Her scandals had not only tarnished the family's reputation, but threatened its very survival. In the 1920s and 1930s, creditors had pursued Henry relentlessly, believing that Almina's debts were secured against the estate itself. Some of these debts were genuine, others were products of her fraud loans taken in the name of the Countess of Carnarvon, long after she had lost the right to use the title. Henry fought back with legal precision. He petitioned courts, repudiated contracts, and produced evidence that his mother had acted without authority. It saved Highclere from outright seizure, but at a cost. The lawsuits consumed money, time, and dignity. For decades, the Herbert family papers bulged, not with letters of romance or diplomacy, but with writs, claims, and rulings, parchments that bore witness to a son's long war against his own mother's shadow. Henry rarely spoke of her. In private, he is said to have referred to her as that woman. Yet his silence was not indifference, it was survival. He knew that to speak her name was to invite scandal back into the house. Generational silence. The burden of Almina's choices did not end with Henry. His heirs inherited not only the estate but the silence that surrounded her. The seventh Earl, Porchy Herbert, grew up in a house where his grandmother was a ghost. Present in rumor, absent in mention, servants whispered about the forbidden Countess, about the locked rooms where her possessions had been stored, about the debts that had nearly destroyed them all. Children were told only fragments, enough to warn but never enough to explain. This silence became its own kind of inheritance. Each generation knew there was something shameful in their bloodline, but not its full extent. In this way, Almina's legacy endured more powerfully than if it had been openly acknowledged. A hidden scandal, after all, has a longer reach than an admitted one. The financial scars, even stripped of Almina's direct influence. Highclere Castle struggled through the 20th century. Maintenance of the estate was costly, and the income that had once come from Rothschild patronage and Egyptian treasures was long gone. Wars, taxes, and agricultural decline gnawed at the family fortune. The Herbert descendants became adept at improvisation, selling land, renting wings of the castle, opening its doors for charitable events. Yet the shadow of bankruptcy always loomed. Visitors to Highclere in the 1950s and 1960s wrote of leaking roofs, crumbling staircases, and shuttered rooms. It was a house too large for its dwindling resources, its very grandeur threatening to collapse upon itself. Behind this decay lay Almina's ruinous legacy. Had she not drained the coffers, pawned the heirlooms, and embroiled the estate in decades of litigation, Highclere might have stood stronger. Instead, every crack in its stone seemed a reminder of her extravagance. The ghost in the castle. It is no surprise then that whispers of haunting began to cling to Highclere. Visitors spoke of cold spots in the corridors, of the faint scent of opium in rooms where Almina had once entertained her lovers, of doors that creaked open at night as though pushed by unseen hands. Servants claimed to hear a woman's voice, sharp and commanding, in the great hall after midnight. One particularly persistent tale concerned the old operating rooms from the wartime hospital. Long after they had been stripped of their medical equipment, visitors described hearing the clatter of surgical instruments, the moans of patients, and most disturbingly the rustle of skirts as a woman moved briskly from bed to bed. When lights were turned on, the rooms were empty. Some said it was the echo of soldiers who had died under Almina's care. Others insisted it was Almina herself, forever reenacting her performance as the benevolent Countess, unable to relinquish the role that had given her power. Whether superstition or memory, the legend endured. The family's uneasy pact. By the late 20th century, the Herbert family adopted an uneasy strategy. They would neither celebrate nor condemn Almina. She was acknowledged in pamphlets for her role in the wartime hospital, but never in depth. Guides to Highclere might mention her in passing, describing her as energetic or unconventional, but avoided discussion of her trial, her bankruptcy, or her rumored medical dealings. This half-truth served a purpose. It allowed the family to preserve dignity while exploiting curiosity. Visitors left with the impression of a remarkable woman, without probing too deeply into what had made her remarkable. Yet within the family, the silence bred unease. Descendants carried not only her blood, but her debts of honor. Some resented her for the ruin she brought. Others admired her audacity, even her ruthlessness, seeing in her the qualities of survival. But none could deny that she remained the most infamous figure in their lineage, a woman whose name was both a curse and a brand. Myth and market. When Downton Abbey brought Highclere to global fame, the family was thrust once more into the spotlight. Tourists flooded the estate, eager to glimpse the real Downton. Inevitably, questions arose about the real history of the castle and its occupant. Once again, Almina's story was rewritten. She was recast as a proto-modern woman, ahead of her time, bold in her charity, daring in her defiance of convention. For every whispered rumor of abortions and affairs, there was an official narrative of compassion and service. Books were sold, tours conducted, documentaries aired, all profiting from her legend while concealing her crimes. In this sense, Almina achieved in death what she had failed to secure in life. She became indispensable to Highclere's brand. The castle's modern survival owed as much to her myth as to its stone, the curse of memory. But myths cannot erase truth. Among archivists, historians and those who seek the shadows, Almina's name remains synonymous with scandal. Her papers, scattered in private hands, continue to surface in auctions, each letter a fragment of the woman behind the legend. In these fragments lies a darker inheritance, the unacknowledged lives of women who sought her help, the soldiers whose pain she commodified, the creditors she deceived, the family she fractured. The Herbert descendants walk proudly through the halls of Highclere, entertaining dignitaries and celebrities beneath chandeliers once dimmed by her death. Yet beneath their pride lingers an unease, for they know what the public does not, that their inheritance is not only land and title, but a stain, impossible to wash away. Thus the story of Lady Almina Carnarvon does not end with her death, nor even with her rehabilitation in popular memory. It endures in the fractures of her lineage, in the silence of her descendants, in the very stones of Highclere Castle. For history, like blood, carries what it cannot purge, and Almina's blood runs still in the veins of her family, a reminder that some legacies are curses, not crown. The truth is never buried. It lingers in ledgers, letters, and the fragile memories of those who dared to speak. If Almina's family endured her scandal as a curse, the archives preserve it as evidence. Though the official records of her medical enterprises were deliberately destroyed in the late 1930s, fragments survived, scraps of correspondence, accounting sheets and testimony extracted under oath during her various trials. To sift through these remains is to glimpse the breadth of her secret operations, and to understand how the Countess built an empire not upon service, but upon exploitation. The hidden ledgers. Among the Herbert family papers lies a series of thin, leather-bound notebooks, their pages crowded with careful, almost clerical handwriting. They are not signed, but contemporary handwriting experts compared them with surviving letters from Almina, and concluded they were hers. Each page lists a name or more often an initial followed by sums of money, sometimes annotated with a terse remark, procedure complete, in recovery, to be paid discreetly. The dates correspond to periods when Almina's so-called nursing homes in London were in operation, particularly the notorious establishment in Bryanston Square. Cross-referencing with known society scandals reveals pact. The initials align with women who vanished from the social scene for weeks at a time, reappearing thinner, paler, but unencumbered by unwanted pregnancies. The sums demanded were staggering, hundreds of pounds per case, more than most families earned in a year. Historians now believe these ledgers represent one of the earliest documented systems of organized, profit-driven abortion services in Britain. To the desperate women who sought her help, Almina may have seemed a savior, yet the clinical notes in her ledgers read less like compassion than commerce. Each body reduced to an entry, each risk calculated against profit. Coded correspondence. Other fragments emerge from the letters of her associates. One particularly chilling exchange survives between Almina and Harold Hendon, who had testified under immunity during the 1925 trial. In a letter dated March 1923, Hendon writes, "The supplies from Paris arrived safely. They are of excellent quality. As before, discretion is imperative. I remind you that one failure will cost us dearly, not only in money, but in position. Ensure that the young ladies are prepared properly this time. The last instance shook my confidence." The supplies scholars believe referred to surgical instruments and chemical agents forbidden under British law. The young ladies were patients whose conditions may have deteriorated due to infection or hemorrhage. Almina's reply, though curt, reveals her unflinching pragmatism. "You concern yourself too much with sentiment. The demand remains, and where demand exists, so too will our profit. If one case fails, 3 more present themselves. Focus on efficiency, not hesitation." This correspondence, preserved only because it was seized by investigators and misfiled among court records, provides a rare glimpse of her private voice, cold, transactional, untroubled by the risks her procedures inflicted. Testimonies of the wounded. Equally damning are the testimonies of soldiers treated at her wartime hospitals. Many were recorded decades later during interviews for regimental histories, long after Almina's death. One veteran,
Captain Edward Emberzern described waking after surgery to find Almina at his bedside, coaxing him into signing papers he did not understand. She said it was for my care, he recalled. Later I learned it bound me to debts for medical fees I never owed. I was in morphine delirium. I would have signed my own death warrant if she had asked. Another spoke of strange visitors who prowled the wards, wealthy men in evening dress, who selected among the wounded as if at a market. She introduced them as patrons. The soldier said, but we knew we were being paraded, our vulnerability put on display. Such accounts suggest her wartime philanthropy doubled as a theater for manipulation, where human suffering became a stage upon which she performed her role as savior, while extracting every advantage. Medical malpractice in the records, even within official military archives, traces of her malpractice remain. A memorandum from the War Office, dated 1917, expresses concern over unorthodox practices at the Carnarvon-funded hospital. Anonymous complaints alleged experimental treatments performed without consent, including radical surgeries and novel chemical therapies. No investigation was pursued. The hospital was too valuable, the Countess too well connected. Yet the language of the memorandum speaks volumes. While the work of the Countess is undoubtedly patriotic, there is troubling evidence that procedures undertaken under her supervision do not meet accepted standards of medical practice. The matter is delicate and requires discretion. That discretion ensured the complaints were buried, but in retrospect, they corroborate survivor testimonies that her hospitals were not sanctuaries, but laboratories, where the wounded were both patients and specimens. The patients who vanished. Rumors persisted of women who entered her London clinics and never re-emerged. Court documents from the 1925 trial mention at least 3 such cases, raised by Dorothy Dennis in her explosive testimony. She alleged that wealthy heiresses, terrified of scandal, had sought Almina's services and been buried quietly after complications. No charges were proven. The women's families had every reason to collude in silence, yet the suggestion casts a long shadow. If true, it would mean that Almina's clinics were not merely exploitative but lethal, and that her fortune was partly built on blood that could never be acknowledged publicly. Almina's own defense, perhaps most haunting of all, are Almina's private notes, discovered after her death. In them she justifies her actions with an unsettling logic. The world despises a woman who breaks convention. I broke it in their service. They came to me because no man could be trusted. No institution could protect them. I gave them freedom, though they cursed me for the price. If some suffered, was that not the price of progress? This rationalization reveals the twisted self-image she carried to the grave. She did not see herself as criminal, but as pioneer, a woman who, in her own words, should have been remembered as a reformer, not condemned as a monster. Yet the archive speaks differently. Each ledger entry, each testimony, each coded letter testifies not to reform, but to exploitation. The scale of the network, taken together, these fragments suggest that Almina's operations extended far beyond what courts ever proved. She controlled multiple clinics, collaborated with doctors across London and Paris, and drew upon a network of discreet financiers. Her reach may have encompassed hundreds of women and soldiers, each reduced to an entry in her book. It is impossible to calculate how many lives she altered, damaged or ended, but it is certain that her legacy cannot be confined to the scandals of one trial. It was systemic, embedded in the very fabric of early 20th century society, where silence and secrecy shielded the powerful. Conclusion: the records of Lady Almina Carnarvon's medical enterprises read today like something out of a Gothic novel. Secret ledgers, coded letters, vanished patients, but they are not fiction. They are the residue of a life lived without scruple, a career built upon the vulnerability of others. And though much has been lost, burned, buried or erased, the fragments that survive are enough to condemn. They reveal a woman who understood society's hypocrisies better than anyone, and who weaponized that knowledge with ruthless precision. History, in the end, did not silence her crimes. The archives remember what people wish to forget, and the name of Lady Almina Carnarvon remains written there indelible.
The stage was set not in the drawing rooms of Highclere but in the harsh glare of the courtroom. There at last the masks began to slip. The trial of 1925. The legal proceedings against Lady Almina in the spring of 1925 represented the culmination of years of rumor, whispers and unproven allegations. Officially, the charge was conspiracy to defraud, an accusation that sounded technical, even abstract. But those who attended the hearings quickly realized that the case was about more than numbers on a page. It was about character, morality, and the unspoken crimes that the polite world dared not name aloud. The Old Bailey was crowded daily. Reporters jostled for positions, sketch artists captured her every glance, and society's curious filed in to witness the Countess face justice. She arrived each morning draped in black, her expression unreadable, as though attending a funeral, perhaps her own. The prosecution, led by Sir Henry Curtis Bennet, opened with an assertion that the noble Countess has abused her title, her wealth, and her influence to enrich herself at the expense of those who trusted her. His voice carried the weight of inevitability, as if the verdict had already been decided. Yet it was not the financial charges that electrified the gallery. It was the stories that leaked between the lines, the coded references to delicate procedures, the mention of women who had disappeared into her care, the suggestion that death, not debt, was her true currency. The evidence unfolds. The Crown laid out Almina's dealings with a clarity that her own ledgers had attempted to obscure. Bank records showed vast sums funneled through shell companies. Correspondence revealed her partnerships with doctors of dubious reputation. Witnesses described her London clinics as unlicensed and unsafe. Then came the more personal accounts. Dorothy Dennis, the society woman whose testimony had already haunted Almina for years, took the stand. She spoke with chilling calm of her experience at Bryanston Square. I was ushered into a darkened room. The curtains were drawn, the instruments already laid out. Lady Almina herself assured me I would be safe, that many before me had left with their reputations intact. I recall pain, then blood, and after that nothing. When I awoke, she was seated at the foot of the bed, counting notes that I had left upon the table. It was not medicine, it was business. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Though abortion remained illegal, and to admit to it carried risk for the witness herself, Dennis spoke with the authority of one who had little left to lose. Almina's counsel attempted to discredit her, suggesting hysteria, exaggeration, or malice, but Dennis's words lingered. They gave form to the rumors, turning whispers into testimony. Cross-examination of the Countess. At last Almina herself was called to the stand. The hush that fell over the chamber was absolute. She sat upright, hands folded, her voice measured but defiant. Under questioning, she denied every charge of impropriety. I devoted my fortune to the care of soldiers, she insisted. I opened my homes to the sick, the poor, the desperate. I was a benefactor, not a criminal. When asked about the ledgers, she claimed they were simple household accounts. When asked about the coded letters, she suggested forgery. When pressed on the vanished patients, she grew cold. I am not responsible, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. If young women choose to take their own lives rather than face disgrace, society must answer for that, not I. The remark sent a chill through the gallery. Even her own counsel winced, for it revealed not only her ruthlessness, but her contempt for those she had exploited. The public reaction. Outside the court, newspapers feasted on the spectacle. Headlines blared, Countess on trial for sinister secrets and aristocracy in disgrace. Editorials debated whether she was a martyr to double standards or a monster unfit to bear her title. For many, the case symbolized the corruption of the aristocracy itself. If a woman of such rank could traffic in scandal and death, what did that say of Britain's ruling class? The public, weary of war, weary of privilege, demanded retribution. Yet there were those who defended her. Some women whispered that Almina had given them choices otherwise denied. Some soldiers swore she had saved their lives in her wartime hospitals. The figure of Lady Almina became a battleground of perception, savior to some, predator to others. The collapse of her defenses. As the weeks wore on, Almina's defenses unraveled. Financial experts demonstrated that her fortune had dwindled not through generosity but through reckless speculation and endless legal payout. Associates once loyal turned against her, providing damning corroboration in exchange for immunity. The climax came with the reading of a final letter, seized during a raid on her Bryanston Square clinic. Written in her hand, it read, "Do not trouble yourself with their cry. They forget their shame as soon as it is lifted. If one falls, it is the price of freedom, and they would pay it 10 times over. We must not falter. There is always another willing to pay." The letter was read aloud in court. Silence followed, broken only by the scratching of pens, as journalists hurried to record every word. For many observers, it was the moment her mask slipped irrevocably, revealing a woman whose pragmatism had curdled into cruelty. The verdict approaches. By June the case reached its end. Summations were delivered, heavy with moral judgment. The jury withdrew, their faces pale with the weight of what they had heard. Outside, crowds waited for hours, pressing against the gates for news. Some cursed her name, others prayed she might walk free. The tension was not merely legal but cultural. a confrontation between old aristocratic privilege and the new demand for accountability. When the jury returned, the air seemed to hold its breath. The foreman spoke slowly, guilty on several counts of fraud, not guilty on charges related to the deaths. The law could not name her true crimes, but it had found enough to condemn. She was sentenced to imprisonment, stripped of much of her fortune, her reputation shattered. The gallery erupted, some in cheers, others in weeping. Almina herself did not flinch. She rose, adjusted her black veil, and allowed herself to be led away as if she had foreseen it all. Aftermath. In the streets. In the weeks that followed, London buzzed with gossip. Pamphlets circulated retelling her story, some lurid, others sympathetic. The aristocracy recoiled from her, disowning her as a pariah. Yet among certain circles of women, her name lingered as a dark kind of legend, proof that even the highest-born could be ruined by the same desperate choices society forced upon them. The government, keen to avoid deeper scandal, moved swiftly to suppress further inquiry. Files were sealed, names redacted, evidence buried, but the damage was done. Lady Almina Carnarvon was no longer the beneficent hostess of Highclere. She was the fallen countess, a cautionary tale, the revelation of scale. Though her trial had focused narrowly on financial improprieties, the whispers of her deeper crimes grew louder after her sentencing. Researchers pieced together fragments, suggesting that the number of women who passed through her clinics numbered in the hundreds, perhaps thousands. Some believed the court had deliberately avoided confronting the full truth, fearing the outrage it would unleash. Others argued that Almina had become a scapegoat for a society unwilling to face its own hypocrisies. Whatever the case, the trial of 1925 revealed enough to strip away the last vestiges of her respectability. One journalist described her final day in court, with words that still resonate. She descended the steps not as a countess, but as a shadow. The crowd parted, not in respect but in fear, as though some contagion clung to her. She did not look back at Highclere, nor at the faces of those who had once adored her. She walked into history as if into a tomb. Thus the public mask of Lady Almina Carnarvon shattered, her name forever stained, her legacy poisoned by the revelations of the trial. Even when the verdict was read and the Countess led away, the truth did not end there. In fact, it had only begun to emerge from beneath its shroud. The aftermath of the trial. Imprisonment might have ended most lives of scandal, but for Lady Almina Carnarvon, it was only the prelude to a darker revelation. The court had condemned her for fraud, but the deeper accusations, the whispers of vanished patients, the aborted heirs of wealthy families, the experimental procedures upon wounded soldiers, remained formally unproven. Yet in the silence that followed her sentencing, new voices emerged. Freed from fear of reprisal, former nurses, attendants and patients began to speak. Their testimonies, collected quietly by journalists and reformers, painted a picture far more chilling than anything admitted in the Old Bailey. The Whisper Network. The women of London's drawing rooms had always whispered about Almina, though their gossip had been tinged with envy as much as suspicion. After 1925, those whispers sharpened into confession. Some recalled being ushered through the side entrance of Bryanston Square, cloaked and veiled, treated in silence, and released with purses lighter and bodies wounded. Others spoke of friends who had gone in but never returned. One haunting account came from a housemaid employed at the Bryanston Square clinic. She remembered cleaning the rooms after special procedures and finding linen soaked beyond salvage. She recalled carrying bundles down to the cellar where, as she claimed, there was always a smell of earth and lime. When asked what became of those bundles, she refused to answer, murmuring only, "We were told not to ask. We were told we'd be next if we did." The hidden burials. It was during this period that rumors of hidden burials began to circulate. Journalists uncovered records of property owned by shell companies linked to Almina, small plots in Kensal Green, Paddington, and on the outskirts of Reading. Officially, they were gardens or storage yards. Unofficially, neighbors recalled late-night deliveries, small wagons draped in tarpaulin, and men with spades working by lantern light. No exhumations were ever sanctioned, but the implication was unavoidable. The vanished women, the unnamed patients, may not have been spirited away abroad, or hidden in anonymity. They may have been buried quietly in unmarked soil, their identities erased, their stories silenced beneath the ground. The soldiers' accounts. Equally disturbing were the testimonies of former soldiers who survived her hospitals. Many, emboldened by the passage of time, confessed that they had been subjected to treatments they never consented to. Some spoke of waking under crude surgeries, others of injections that left them delirious.
A few described fellow patients who slipped away during the night and were never spoken of again. One letter, preserved in a regimental archive, reads, "I would rather have bled to death on the fields of Ypres than have been saved only to be cut and probed in that place. We were not men to her, only bodies upon which she practiced her experiments. I owe her no gratitude. I owe her only nightmares." Such accounts reframed her supposed philanthropy not as sacrifice, but as exploitation. Her hospital wards functioning as laboratories where desperation made men pliable and powerless. The papers she could not burn. After Almina's death in 1969, executors combed through her possessions. Much had been destroyed, letters burned, ledgers ripped apart, but in a locked trunk at her final residence, fragments remained. Among them was a draft of a memoir she never published. In one chilling passage she wrote, "The world will never know how much was spared because of me. They will call it crime, but I call it necessity. When the men returned from war broken, when the women returned from hospitals ruined, I gave them a choice. They cursed me for the price, but still they came. Always they came. I was the only one who dared." Another page, heavily crossed out but still legible beneath the ink, read, "If there were deaths, they were not my fault. Nature is cruel. I only hastened what she began. I merely opened the door." Even in her private writings she refused remorse. To the end she saw herself as a figure of grim necessity, above law and morality. The families who paid for silence. Reformers investigating her life uncovered yet another pattern. Large donations recorded in the Carnarvon accounts, often from noble families, whose daughters had been linked with scandal. These payments coincided with sudden disappearances from society columns. The vanishing of a betrothal, the quiet withdrawal of a young lady from the season. It is now believed that many families paid Almina not only for her procedures, but for her silence. In this way she became not merely a provider of illicit services, but a custodian of aristocratic secrets. Her fortune was built not just upon the desperation of women, but upon the hypocrisy of the very class to which she belonged, a scale beyond comprehension. By the time researchers pieced together the surviving fragments, ledgers, testimonies, hidden properties and confessions, it became clear that the scale of Almina's influence was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1916 and 1925, her clinics may have seen upwards of 2,000 women. How many left unharmed, how many scarred, and how many never left at all cannot be known. Add to this the soldiers who passed through her wards, perhaps hundreds subjected to procedures they did not understand, and the image darkens further. The trial had revealed a fraudster. The archive, however, reveals something closer to a predator cloaked in philanthropy. The final image. In 1969, when her body was lowered into the earth, only a handful attended. The grandeur of Highclere was long lost to her. The Carnarvon name had distanced itself from her scandals. She was buried not as a countess, but as an old woman, bankrupt and forgotten. And yet for all the obscurity of her grave, her presence lingers, in the unmarked plots that may still conceal her victims, in the families who carried their shame to their own graves, and in the soldiers who wrote of her as a figure from their nightmare. One contemporary historian summarized it starkly. Lady Almina Carnarvon represents not only the corruption of one woman, but the corruption of a society that enabled her. Her shadow stretches across the century, and it cannot be measured by the sentence she served, but by the countless lives she touched and destroyed. Closing of the penultimate chapter. Thus we arrive at the darkest revelation, that the trial did not reveal the full truth, but only scratched the surface. The real scale of Lady Almina's empire of exploitation, silence and death remains buried, quite literally, in the soil of England. And in that soil, some whisper she still keeps her secrets.
The fall of a house is not always marked by the collapse of its walls, but by the silence that falls when its mistress is gone. The waning years. By the late 1940s, Almina Carnarvon was a woman in retreat. The great estates she had once commanded were no longer hers. The jewels, the paintings, the libraries sold, pawned or replaced with counterfeits. The Carnarvon family, once bound reluctantly to her by marriage and wealth, had long since severed ties. To London society she was an outcast. To her son Henry, an enemy who had plundered his birthright. She moved from house to house, shrinking each time. The grandeur of Bryanston Square gave way to anonymous flats, and eventually to the modest terrace in Bristol where she would live out her final years. The Countess, who had once entertained dukes and generals, now dined on scraps and relied upon the loyalty of Anne Lidbetter, the servant who refused to abandon her. Her body, once adorned with the finest gowns, betrayed her. Arthritis twisted her joints. Her lungs weakened, her mind wandered between lucidity and delusion, yet her tongue remained sharp, her self-justifications endless. Visitors, few though they were, recorded the same impression, an old woman who still believed she had been wronged by the world. The last grift. Even in decline, Almina sought ways to monetize her past. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 had cemented her place in history, and she never ceased to remind others that it was her fortune that had financed Lord Carnarvon's expedition. In the 1950s, she began writing articles for popular magazines, promising exclusive revelations about Howard Carter, the Pharaoh's curse, and her role in the find. The truth was that her role had been financial, but Almina blurred fact and invention until even she seemed unable to distinguish one from the other. Lectures followed. In provincial halls and minor societies, she addressed curious audiences, weaving tales of intimate involvement with the excavation, of secret treasures hidden from public view, of conversations with Carter by lantern light in the Valley of the King. Listeners reported a strange spectacle. A once great countess, now shabby and trembling, spinning stories half historical, half fantastical, demanding the attention she could no longer command in society. Her writings and lectures earned little money. What they did reveal, however, was the depth of her need to be remembered, not as a criminal, not as a fraudster, but as a benefactor of history. Bankruptcy and ruin. The Inland Revenue had other plans. In 1951, armed with evidence supplied by her own son Henry, the government pursued her for decades of unpaid taxes. Investigators uncovered offshore accounts, falsified ledgers, and shell companies designed to conceal vast sums. The case confirmed what many had long suspected, that Almina's empire of philanthropy had been at its core a sophisticated machine of fraud. The penalties were devastating. Whatever remnants of her fortune remained were bankruptcy stripped her of possessions, and bailiffs carted away even the trinkets she had clung to. By the late 1950s, she survived on charity, her title reduced to an empty courtesy, and yet even then she boasted to neighbors of her millions and her connection. Denial had become her final currency. The isolation, the ostracism was complete. Former friends no longer wrote. Aristocrats who had once used her services now avoided even her name, lest association revive old scandals. Charitable boards struck her from their record. She had become a ghost haunting the edges of polite society. Her son Henry never forgave her. When he inherited Highclere, he launched a quiet but relentless campaign to erase her from the family legacy. To him she was not the Countess of Carnarvon, but the thief who had pillaged his patrimony. Almina, in return, poured her bitterness into her diaries. She wrote of betrayal, of ingratitude, of a society that had used her, and then discarded her. In her mind she was never the villain. She was the misunderstood benefactor, the victim of jealousy and hypocrisy. The final meal. On May 8, 1969, Almina Herbert, Countess of Carnarvon, sat down to a modest supper in her Bristol home. With her was Anne Lidbetter, her lifelong servant turned companion, who had remained faithful when all others had abandoned her. The meal was unremarkable. Chicken, bread, a glass of weak sherry, but in the act of eating, fate delivered its final irony. A piece of gristle lodged in her throat. Within minutes she was choking. Anne panicked, tried to save her, but it was too late. The woman who had consumed wealth, power, and the lives of others far beyond her measure, died by consuming more than her body could endure. Death was swift, and in its swiftness perhaps merciful. The final betrayal. Her funeral was sparsely attended. No dukes, no grandees, no family save for a distant relation. She was laid to rest quietly, without grandeur. For a woman who had once commanded the attention of half of London, the obscurity of her burial was a final humiliation. Yet even death did not silence her capacity for cruelty. When her will was read, it revealed one last act of vengeance. Rather than leaving her meager estate to her son or grandchildren, she bequeathed the bulk of it to Anthony Lidbetter, Anne's son, the child of a servant not of nobility. The gesture was partly gratitude for Anne's loyalty, but those who knew Almina understood the deeper motive, revenge. Her son Henry, who had exposed her crimes, was cut out entirely. The Carnarvon family, which had disowned her, received nothing. In death, as in life, she preferred spite over reconciliation. The diaries. What survived her was not wealth but words. In the aftermath, her personal papers were discovered. Diaries spanning more than 50 years. Letters unsent, notes unfinished. They revealed the inner landscape of a mind steeped in narcissism and paranoia. She wrote of her sacrifices, of the gratitude owed her, of the jealous enemies who conspired against her.
She reimagined scandals as triumphs, crimes as service, even the illegal abortions, the coerced soldiers, the financial frauds. She framed them as necessary acts misunderstood by the world. The most haunting entries were the final ones, written in a hand so shaky it was barely legible. They described a fantasy world in which she was beloved, where the king thanked her personally for her service, where women she had helped returned in tears of gratitude. It was delusion, but also confession, an unconscious admission that her life had been built upon lies so often repeated they became truth to her alone. The legacy, Lady Almina Carnarvon, remains a paradox.